Support comes from Thomas Nelson Community College, now becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College, the first choice to start a bachelor's degree since tuition is one-third the cost of four-year schools. More at tncc.edu.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever. Whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.
Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. In our continuing quest to bring understanding and compassion between races, ethnicities, and cultures, on today's broadcast, we explore the relationships between African Americans and Asian Americans in this country. You know the stereotypes. On every corner in the Black community, there's a Chinese carryout. Every nail salon is run by the Vietnamese. Assumptions that all Asians are brilliant. Assumptions that all Blacks are lazy. What's the true story behind our cultures, and what's the answer to the question, why can't we be friends? Stay with us. Another View will be right back after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRV News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. I heard it's 70 degrees outside, and I just cannot wait to get back out there. Right now, we're here in the studio. Just a couple of things going on in the community before we get into our very, very instructive and insightful conversation about the relationship between African Americans and Asian Americans in our country. So just want to tell you about the Norfolk chapter of Links Incorporated is hosting a virtual HIV awareness forum. It is this Saturday, December the 4th, from 9 a.m. until noon, and they're going to educate you about HIV and how it affects the body, to increase awareness about the impact of HIV in the African American community, and to help the community better understand the evolution of the disease and the progress that's being made to not only manage but also prevent HIV in the future. So you can go to NorfolkLinksInc.org. That's NorfolkLinksInc.org and find out where you get to register for the virtual conference that's being held this Saturday, December the 4th, from 9 a.m. until noon. And then on Monday, December the 6th, there's a program called Jazz in Paris. It is being done by the Baron and Ellen Gordon Art Galleries in conjunction with Old Dominion University. And Dr. Peter Schulman and Tim Siebels and our very own Jay Sennett and Dr. Dolores Phillips of the ODU Department of English. They're all going to honor a Norfolk-born jazz expatriate, Peanuts Holland, who achieved greatness in Paris in the 1950s. He had to go there because he couldn't perform here in the United States. So the event is free. It's open to the public, and you can register at oduartstix.com. So I'll spell that, oduartstix.com. And it's going to take place at the galleries at 4509 Monarch Way in Norfolk. It's free, so come on out. Join the conversation. That sounds really, really interesting. And if you are a minority student who identifies as Black, African American, Hispanic or Latino, American Asian, Indian, or Native or Alaska Native, Asian or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, then you are eligible to apply for the Dominion Energy Educational Equity Scholarship Program. Now, they are giving away money to help students from minority communities to continue their education. You must be a high school and senior or graduate or a current college undergraduate residing in Connecticut, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Indiana, Wyoming, or Utah, which I believe are the states where Dominion has its reach. You must plan to enroll as a full-time undergraduate student at an accredited 2 or 4-year college, and you must have a minimum grade point average of 3.0 on a 4-point scale. So to find out more information, please go send an email to dominionenergy@scholarshipamerica.org. That's dominionenergy@scholarshipamerica.org, and go get that money because it's out there and it is available to you. So I had an experience recently. I was doing a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice training for a local group, and I was taken aback by the anger and hostility of some of the Asian American participants towards African Americans. It made me flash back to a conversation I had a while ago about the relationship between Blacks and Asians, and that conversation was with one of our guests. I want to welcome Richard Luong. He is the Director of Institutional Advancement for Rising for Justice, and he's a former colleague here at WHRO. Hey, Richard, how you doing?
Hi, Barbara. So great to be here.
And it is so good to see you again. Absolutely.
Yeah, no,
it's been a while.
Wonderful. It's been way too long.
Absolutely. May Nivar is a fellow with CEO Action for Racial Equity. Hello, May. How are you?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And Ting-Yi Oei is the Education Director for the 1882 Foundation. Did I say that right, Ting-Yi?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate that. So, Richard, do you remember that conversation that we had a while ago? I believe it was around the George Floyd event, wasn't it?
We did. And I do remember us having that conversation, and it was after the events and the tragedy of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And we started talking about, or I kind of brought up that one of the officers who was involved and was kind of standing by and keeping people away was an Asian American. And when I saw him, I kind of had just like this really visceral reaction of like deep sadness and kind of like shame about the fact that somebody who, you know, looked like my uncles and looked like people I knew from my community was involved in a tragedy like that. And then kind of the fact that in turn spurred a lot of conversations between myself and other Asian American people within my kind of like sphere.
Mm-hmm. And you said to me at that point, you know, Barbie, you should do a show about the relationship. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, that's really a good idea. And then I thought, you know, is there a relationship? I mean, really, it really had not permeated, I guess, my thought pattern in terms of what really does go on between the Black community and the Asian community. But Ting-Yi, let me ask you this. As we talk about the Asian community, who are we talking about? Because that's a pretty broad phrase, isn't it?
It is. It's a very, very broad expression. And, you know, the nomenclature that we use of Asian American does encompass a very, very broad region. If you look at it from sort of a geographic perspective, you could be speaking about what is, you know, totally Asia, going all the way to the, you know, Eastern Mediterranean and east from there. But I think in practical terms, and particularly from a legislative point of view, historically, the term, you know, Asian American refers really to what is today Pakistan, the old part of the British Empire, and everything east of there, including Southeast Asia and East Asia through the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, and that would then be the definition. As far as I think the usage of the term amongst Asian Americans themselves, it's very much you know, a question of self-identification, as it is with so many other, you know, ethnic groups as well. But I think more and more, as there is a question of kind of solidarity and seeing our issues together, what I just described there, which includes South Asians all the way through the Pacific, Native Hawaiians, that is really sort of the definition we use now for speaking about this group.
Okay. So, May, I'm going to ask this of all three of you. Is there a hierarchy, you know, within the Asian American community? In other words, is it you know, more prestigious to be from one group, being Chinese or Japanese or Korean or whatever, or is there any kind of economic hierarchy within the community itself? I'm trying to get people to understand, if you're looking at the community from the outside, you know, how do people perceive that?
Yeah, absolutely. Just given what Ting-Yi was saying about just the vast diversity of the community, there's definitely varying degrees of socioeconomic status and experiences. There's just so many different languages, different countries, even traditions and cultures. So I think from my observation and based on, even my sphere of influence, I think when people hear the term Asian American, they see a certain type, and that is predominantly East Asian, which comprises of China, Japan, so Japanese, Chinese, Korean, even Vietnamese, and there's a lot of conversation even amongst Asian Americans about that. So Indian and Chinese, are more affluent, more educated, but there's a very wide economic gap within the Asian American community. Down to, speaking about the lower income of Hmong Americans and Cambodians, there's a very wide gap. And so when there are solutions to address issues within the community, there's no one size fits all. There really needs to be a viewpoint and research amongst, who is the target audience for which these solutions are geared toward. Because again, what may be helpful and supportive for the Indian community, which, by the way, not everyone realizes that India is in the continent of Asia, and therefore Indians are Asian as well.
They kind of get their own category, don't they?
True, and that is a perception, right? Yeah. And so what may work and be supportive for the Indian community is not going to be the same needs. In fact, it's very inequitable.
Richard, when again, people from the outside looking in, if you looked at media, you would not think that Asian Americans in general have an economic problem. I mean, because you're all rich and you all own your own businesses and you all, and I'm really being facetious here. That's a narrative that's out there, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. No. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at is this model minority narrative where, in kind of like framing it that way, you have the Asians as the model minority, but then it gets framed against minorities who are not the model minority, and that's very problematic because in framing that way, you're saying there's a group of other minorities that are not up to a certain ideal or standard or living a particular way. When you boil it down, it's kind of like what minorities kind of like have the closest proximity, like let's say to whiteness, and that's what we were discussing previously is kind of like that's a really anti-Black way of thinking, but it also ignores a point that May brought up, which is that within the Asian American community, which is incredibly vast, it's a whole continent of people of different backgrounds and cultures and traditions, there exists a huge economic gap of folks who are affluent and who like fit into that model minority stereotype, but then there's also very large pockets of the Asian American community who are of a lower socioeconomic status and who are in need.
Ting-Yi, explain exactly what the model minority myth is.
I think that it's came into prominence particularly during the 1980s, during the Reagan era, when he made comments on several different occasions that kind of held up the Asian American community as sort of a model minority. They knew how to assimilate, and that's a term I have particular problems with, into the American mainstream. And while it may seem complimentary, I think, as Richard just suggested here too, there's a pernicious side to it. Not only does it misrepresent, I think, the vast wideness of the Asian American community, but it also diminishes other minorities within the country. For example, if Asian Americans are doing the right thing, so to speak, in assimilating to this American way of life, then what is it saying about all the other minorities, including African Americans? That somehow this group of Asian Americans has thrived. And in fact, of course, as Rich has also pointed out, that this thriving isn't universal by any means. There are different groups who've come here for different reasons, some as refugees who really struggled, and whether it's fishermen from Vietnam down in Louisiana who've struggled to make a life of their own, or others in this country who, work in menial jobs, such as custodial jobs or cafeteria workers. And I hesitate to use that word, and I'm sorry I did, of menial tasks. But I think, I worked most of my career in Northern Virginia as a teacher and administrator. And when you look at this makeup of staff, custodians and cafeteria workers, it's overwhelmingly Latino and Asian in that particular group. So we really do a disservice by using that term model minority to describe this wide diversity that exists within the community and success and failure that doesn't come to everybody.
And you have a phrase that you use that I would love for you to expound on. You say you're acceptable but not accepted.
Thank you for reminding me of that one there. Yeah, no, I think, and actually I have to give credit to someone else. I believe it's San Francisco State who first used the term in a conversation I was having with her. And then I've kind of adopted it. But I think it really does capture that notion that, yes, so long as Asian Americans in this case really behave a certain way, they have become acceptable. And I think because of the nature of how Asians and particularly Chinese Americans initially came to the country, there was this level of acceptability that they had to fight for because they weren't allowed to enter the country and then they couldn't become citizens, that it made it very difficult. But being acceptable is not the same as truly being accepted. And I think that's, speaking, I think, to your overall theme here of commonalities among the different experiences, there are certain kind of things that no matter what you do, whether it's achieving a certain level of attainment in education or serving in the military or, being able to finally vote, those are things that kind of lead themselves towards being accepted. But for minority groups in general, Asian Americans included, that isn't always the case.
May, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was saying that one of her assistants at one point in her career was Asian American, and there was a slur. She's African American, and there was a slur from someone else who said something about her, and the Asian American assistant, went to her and said, "Are you okay? I know that that's a bad word and so forth." But as they continued the conversation, the Asian American woman said, we keep our heads down, we work hard, and we push through, and that's why we succeed. And Black people talk too much and you yell about what's wrong, and that's why you have a problem. And I'm paraphrasing there, but is that a regular kind of a common thought? That Black people complain, expect things to be given to them, while Asian people keep their heads down and just go for it, and that's why they're able to succeed. And that's another part of that whole model minority thought.
Yes, it speaks to what Richard and Ting-Yi has been referring to, which is that model minority and how to behave and assimilate. I often even use, don't rock the boat. I mean, my own experiences have been, and in terms of how I was raised as well, is like, don't get involved. Don't talk about this. Don't speak up too much. Which it's ironic considering my involvement of being more vocal the past several years. It's all coming out now, but truly it's part of the culture and how many of us have been raised, which is put your head down, do a good job, and you will be recognized. Don't rock the boat, because if you do that, you're going to draw too much attention to yourself. You're going to be viewed as particularly in the work environment, as insubordinate, not a hard worker. And these things really speak to how we don't want to be viewed as not hardworking or diligent or loyal, for that matter, trustworthy. The status is very meaningful in the workplace, in society, and in the community. And so anything that would draw behaviors that would be out of the areas of obedience and compliance, would be viewed as you're rocking the boat and drawing attention. So when that is put, in contrast to other groups, whether it's the Latinos or the Black community or anybody that doesn't fit that particular mold or norm, would be viewed as you're loud, you're rocking the boat. So yes, it definitely exists.
Richard?
Oh yeah, I would echo a lot of things that May just said, and again, I think speaking to the complexity of this issue, I think it also depends a lot on kind of like generationally what kind of perspective an Asian American has. Like, for example, my parents are both refugees. They're of a community who came to a foreign place. But in the process of coming to a foreign place, everything is foreign to them too. They don't understand the history of this country. They don't understand the historical context and the history of Black struggle in this country. They also don't understand like Black and Asian solidarity that happened during the civil rights movement to get to the point that they could come to this country and be living the lives from the point that they were able to live it without having to, fight for additional rights or be in a position where they had to struggle in different ways than the ways that they were struggling. So I think part of the reason why we almost like can be in this privileged position where we can put our heads down and just work is because of Black struggle that got us to the point that we can even be in that position.
Wow. Ting-Yi, I know you're the historian of the group, so I'm going to ask you to, give us the elevator speech. I know this is really unfair, but give us some context in terms of the history and just how our histories have intertwined and helped both groups. To Richard's point about that solidarity.
Yeah, I think the kind of starting point is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which I think some people may know. It doesn't get taught very much in schools, but that from 1882 on until 1943, Chinese could not legally enter the country except through some narrow provisions and exceptions. So that immediately put obviously a damper on immigration, but also on the view of other Americans towards Chinese. And in particular, it also denied them citizenship, which is sometimes forgotten as part of that. So that meant that when you hear about, for example, Angel Island being the Ellis Island of the West, that's a real misconception because Ellis Island, for some of the hardships and all that went on, it was a welcoming station. On the other hand, Angel Island was designed to keep Chinese and later other Asians out of the country. So some of the demeanor that was being mentioned about keeping down and keeping yourself, out of the face, it's not unlike, say, Latinos today who cross the border and really in many ways have to stay below the surface of the economy of the country and don't want themselves to be really particularly known because it may turn out to be that they were paper sons or paper daughters, expressions used to be that somehow they got into the country illegally. Using false papers or something else like that. So there's that background and backdrop to a lot of the kind of things that were going on. There's an awful lot, historically to try to, where you again find similarities to the kinds of things going on that have faced other minority groups too. But for example, the trying to drive Chinese out and other Asians in later times, most notably the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. But already in the 1880s and 1890s, there were tremendous efforts to expel Chinese out of communities after the Chinese Exclusion Act. And there was a notorious lynching that actually predates the Exclusion Act, 1871, of 19 Chinese who were just brutally massacred in Los Angeles. And it's a footnote to a lot of history, but it's the kind of thing that marks, again, the kind of views that I think Chinese and later Asians carried with them into the future, but also the way other Americans have looked at them.
as things go on. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the relationship between Black and Asian communities in America. My guests are Richard Luong, Director of Institutional Advancement with Rising for Justice and a former colleague here at WHRO. May Nivar, a fellow with CEO Action for Racial Equity, and Ting-Yi Oei, Education Director for the 1882 Foundation. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. What is your relationship, if you have personal relationships between yourself and as an African American and an Asian person, or what questions do you have about the Asian community and about how all of us can learn to get along together? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. May, now I know your fellowship is involved very specifically with working with the African American community. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Sure. The fellowship actually started a year ago, and it was in response to the murder of George Floyd and other unarmed African Americans. It was actually started by the accounting firm PwC. It's over 100 companies dedicating talent full-time to work on federal, state policies and corporate engagement strategies to fight societal systemic racism. And our focus is to positively impact the 47 plus million Black Americans and improve societal well-being. And we've been focusing on four key areas: education, economic empowerment, healthcare, and public safety. And we, this past summer, finalized our issue agenda, and it ranges from, trying to close the digital divide, a path toward greater food equity, early childhood education, decriminalizing poverty, working with HBCUs, which are historically Black colleges and universities. Yep, colleges and universities. I'm so used to using the acronyms.
I know, it's okay.
To actually spell it out, it takes me a moment. Something that actually Virginia did, which is declaring racism as a public health crisis, and working on how to create and advance a national police misconduct registry. I personally am working on a solution with my team on voting rights and how to remove barriers to voting rights. And so looking at federal and state legislation on how to, again, remove those barriers. So it's great.
So as a minority, working very specifically to address issues facing a different minority, does that make you feel that something is being taken away from you? Because I'm wondering if that's part of kind of the narrative that we hear a lot also.
I totally agree. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because this is, many of us in the community talk about this, about it not being a zero-sum game. Also, I'm use the term, a rising tide lifts all boats. I look at this platform, this opportunity, or any opportunity for that matter, uplifting the African American community is uplifting and will help address the root cause, which is systemic racism and white supremacy. That will in turn help all the other marginalized communities as well. So there is no, robbing Peter to pay Paul here. It's about all of us working together to combat the root cause, which is systemic racism.
Yeah, I was reading as I was doing my research for today's show, and that theme came up a lot. The whole idea of using white supremacy, using systemic racism as a way to keep us divided so that we don't come together. And it's just another form of keeping certain people in their place, so to speak. Richard. Yeah,
no, I mean, I totally agree with what May said in the sense, and what you just said in the sense that just while the experiences between Asian Americans and Black Americans is very different, and the way we experience systemic racism is different in many ways, it's all connected, and they need to be addressed simultaneously, and it's not something where it's just like we address one and that takes away from another. It's all about being able to see, kind of like zoom out and see what systems are in place that kind of affect both communities. And when you do that, like May said, it really is a system of white supremacy and white nationalism, and systems that try to keep power in places that power already is.
Mm-hmm. Ting-Yi, I'm curious about, because I found this fascinating, when I was reading about how so many Asians were able to start businesses, and the businesses were started in the Black communities. Can you tell us about that history and why that happened?
Yeah, I mentioned before about the Exclusion Act, and they were sort of limited jobs that you come into the country for if you were a student or if you were a merchant with a particular skill. So many Chinese, whether they had that background or not, came in as merchants doing kinds of the tasks that other people many times didn't want to do, laundry, say, or restaurants and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But some of these communities developed in unusual places. One of them, for example, most people only have a faint knowledge of, was in the Mississippi Delta. And so that there are communities that grew up there. There's an excellent documentary that was shown actually on public broadcasting called Far East, Deep South, about one such family that made its home there in the Deep South. And really their audience or their the people who bought from their stores were from the African-American community. So they became really very much intertwined. And yet there are also tensions there because it kind of gets at some other things there. The first real challenge to Plessy versus Ferguson came in Mississippi from a case called Gong Lum versus Rice, where they challenged the Chinese family, Gong Lum, challenged the segregation laws that existed at the time, and they felt they should be allowed to go to school with whites. And the long story made short is that the courts ruled against them, Supreme Court, and said, no, you cannot go to school with whites. So this is one of those things where the first challenge to Plessy versus Ferguson, came about in the 1920s as a result of that. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of different kinds of things and, personal stories. If I may just give you one other quick one that kind of reflects my own situation, take the case of Loving versus Virginia, which ended miscegenation across the country. But I was married here in Virginia in 1974, but 7 years before, that was when Loving versus Virginia was decided. So my wife, who was white, would have been forbidden to marry me just 7 years earlier. I know that when I was in the classroom and I related that story, that was really kind of a something that reverberated with just the students in my classroom because they could see me there in the classroom. And another kind of thing with that's, I think, important to mention is that the Japanese American Citizens League wrote an amicus brief. A lawyer by the name of William Muratani wrote a brief in favor of the Lovings in that particular case. It was cited as a very consequential piece of information that the Supreme Court had to consider in overturning the miscegenation laws in Loving versus Virginia.
And May, you could relate also, and because you would not have been able to marry your husband either, right?
That's right. And so for viewers, my husband is Afro-Latino, Dominican. Mm-hmm. And we actually, met in New York and have 3 children. And so you're absolutely right. That would have prevented us from getting married as well.
How do your children identify?
It depends on the situation. Yeah, of course. I think it goes back to Ting-Yi's earlier point as well about sort of the situation. They identify as mixed, as Asian, Black, Black Hispanic, Chinese, Dominican. So depending on the context in which they need to identify, whether it's on a form, they will identify accordingly. Of course, they're American.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but when they're hanging out with their friends, I mean, do their friends look at them as as black? Do they look at them as Asian? Do they look at them as they don't care? That's the thing I love about young people today. It's particularly, kids like my granddaughter's age and all. They're all just like, hey, we're people. We're here. Let's do this.
Sure.
But unfortunately, the entire country's not there yet.
Right. Two of my children actually, look more Asian. My son, who of the two, he actually identifies as black. Even though he looks more Asian, he will identify as black Asian. My middle child, my daughter, looks more mixed. She has darker skin, very wavy hair. In fact, she probably gets the most questions of, where are you?
Where are you? Yeah.
What are you? Where are you from? Which could have do you have enough time to have a conversation about those biases and stereotypes?
Yeah, exactly.
Of the perpetual foreigner. But she does get more of the, where are you from?
And she was born here in the United States, right?
Yes. It's because she doesn't look one way or the other. And so she definitely gets a little bit more questions about her ethnic background.
So I wonder, and Ting-Yi, you might be able to start this part of the conversation, but anybody jump in. So the Korean War and the Vietnam War, I know very specifically in terms of black soldiers being there and shaping the dynamic of how people perceive black people. And then a lot of times they had children. And so there's a lot of mixture of the races there. Are those children accepted by the Asian American community?
Ooh, that's a tough question here. I think when you're speaking about different generational differences, one of the things that's just really wonderful, I think, about young people, as you kind of suggested already, is there's a sense, hey, we're here, this is who we are, live with it. And I think that's an important part of it. When you look back maybe a generation or two, there's certainly, I think, ramifications of it, not just here in this country, but I think mixed marriages or mixed relationships, really, and children of those relationships, say in Korea or Vietnam, there are many stories about those things that are those kinds of relationships that are the source of interesting, I think, sociological kinds of questions. But I think one of the advantages we have here in this country is that we do kind of accept all these mixing and matching of different races and ethnicities. I was kind of unusual because my parents were of Chinese and Dutch background, and I don't look particularly Asian. You can see it maybe, in some of my expressions and that kind of thing. But so there's this kind of thing where you learn to kind of walk a middle ground of, what society and what kind of culture that you think you represent most. I came, for example, to really embrace, say, the Asian side of me much later in life. So I think this is kind of an ongoing question for, parents, May's, family. I'm sure this is the source of a lot of discussion. It's worth throwing in here, too, that there's an interesting case that I became aware of that's down from, the Hampton Roads area. Regina Boone, you may be familiar with her story, but her grandfather was Japanese, who married an African-American woman, actually never married. But he was put into a Japanese-American incarceration camp during World War II. And so Regina never got a chance to know her grandfather. But this is kind of an interesting story as well that, I think is really part of a Virginia story that we need to tell more as well.
Richard, you wanted to respond to that also?
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess back to your original question regarding kind of like Black Americans in Vietnam, and I can only speak to that specifically because that's the community that I'm a part of. As far as their acceptance, I would say it's, as far as I know, it's like 100%. If you're part Vietnamese, Vietnamese people are like, you're Vietnamese, and you're one of us, and you get fully embraced. And I mean, I don't know if that's the case between, as we said, Asia's huge and different cultures with different traditions. If that's the case in other countries, if that's the case with children in Korea, but I can say in Vietnam, that's been my experience. And kind of a coincidence, I'm the third panelist here who's also in interracial marriage. So
that's right. Congratulations.
So yeah, no,
by
like
the way.
loving, like loving. I thought a lot about loving in the past year or two. Anytime that kind of anniversary of the loving decision comes up, I think about that too.
Yeah, it made a huge difference for everybody in the country. Yeah, definitely. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Do you have any questions for our guests? Give us a call, 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. I find a lot of times when we're having conversations like this, people just really want to listen and learn as much as they can. Here's a quote that I got from an article that I read from Vox about this whole discussion. And it says, quote, "If you take a holistic look at our history, I truly believe that Asian Americans have more in common with the African American community than with the white community in America," Pastor Chang said. He's a pastor out in California. "The fact that many people don't know that shows how historically malnourished we are and how fragmented our understanding of history is." Ting-Yi, I'm curious about your reaction to that, and then I'll come to you, May, and then to you, Richard.
I really like that quote. I think he's absolutely correct that we do identify in many ways with more of the African-American experience and that of other minorities. And yet at the same time, understand there's a difference. One of the things that the 1882 Foundation got involved in a few years ago was producing a film called Through Chinatown's Eyes. And it's set in, it goes through 1965 after 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and what that meant for the Chinese community in D.C.'s Chinatown. And they were a community very much caught in the middle between, say, living predominantly around an African-American community in D.C., and yet having to try to make their way into the white community. And there's one comment by a woman there who says, we always recognized there was a difference. And then she particularly mentioned Glen Echo, a park that used to be racially segregated in Maryland, that Asians were allowed to go there, but blacks were not. And she also, mentioned sort of in the same vein, we could sometimes walk in the front door, maybe had to walk around and back, but blacks always had to walk around in and back. And so I think there's this consciousness that there's a lot in common, and yet also recognizing there's similarities and trying to find ways in which we can identify with that and some of the struggles and the hardships that have gone through. So it is an awareness and a very conscious one, I think, for most Asian Americans.
Okay. And May, your response to the quote that I read?
Same here. I think there are a lot of common themes and traditions, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the model minority myth, and it's such a social construct that's been created to put a wedge between our communities, and the lack of education, as you mentioned, that is also purposeful. Right, so that we don't fully understand. I didn't and still don't know everything. I'm so glad Ting-Yi's on this show because he definitely has a lot more historical perspective than I do. But that's because it wasn't there growing up, right? And so I think about my children as well, not being able to have this education to fully understand and appreciate the historical context. And so here we are. And you add on the biases and stereotypes and the racism that is seen and observed, it just further perpetuates the divide. And so I think that opportunities to really understand and get to know one another, always take opportunities to diversify your circle around you, certainly helps to better understand each other's experience, and then go like, wow, we actually have a lot more in common than perhaps the media or the society or whatever social construct is created to again put a wedge between our communities.
Absolutely. Get to know people on an individual basis, and it makes a huge difference. Richard, I'll let you respond, and we're going to take some calls.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, and I think both put it so well, and I would like to echo what May just said in the sense that I think education is a really big part of it. being able to learn about the history of racism in this country, and that it also included racism against Asians, which I think a lot of Asians necessarily haven't learned. They may have experienced racism firsthand, but they may not understand the institutions and the history behind it and how connected they are with how those have historically also affected the Black community. And when you kind of are able to contextualize in that way and learn history, but also like look within yourself and be vulnerable and have those conversations within your community, that's when you can kind of start to reach understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to June in Norfolk. Hi, June. You're on the air.
Hi. How are you?
Okay. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. Well, I'm listening to the broadcast, and I said I should call. Well,
good.
Like I said, I'm June. I'm a 76-year-old man, born and raised in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. My father's a Black Army, mm-hmm. and married my mom. Mm-hmm. Lo and behold, I'm here. I never met my father, but my mom raised me, and now I joined the military, and I have 2 kids. Mm-hmm. And I always told my 2 kids that if somebody asks you, what are you? You should ask them what they are, because you're American. I am the only Filipino American in this family. That's what I enforce on my kids, because I'm from the Philippines, born and raised, and I became a citizen, American citizen. You guys are born and raised here. You're American. That's what I told them.
So was it important to you to teach them about your Filipino heritage?
Oh, yeah, they know Filipino heritage.
Okay.
But they never really know until about the Black heritage. Because I don't.
Oh, because I see. I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you for the call, June. We appreciate that. I mean, it becomes complicated, doesn't it, Richard, in terms of when you have different races coming together, and sometimes one part can be left out, which is unfortunate.
100%. And that happens even within, just like generationally within the same race. So like, yeah, I think that's a huge worry of people of my parents' generation, is that as their children begin to have children and those children begin to have children, that culture becomes lost in the process, because you are, in a sense, becoming Americanized, and you're taking in another culture because that's where you live.
Let's go to Douglas in Virginia Beach. Hi, Douglas. You're on the air.
Hello there. What I wanted, and the gentleman just before me actually touched on something that I was aware of. Mm-hmm. That the Filipino people in this area are probably the largest Asians in America, if I'm not mistaken. They're here. They're in the DMV, which is the Washington, D.C. area, New York, the West Coast. And I've found over the years that Filipinos and Blacks tend to get along a lot easier with their cultural differences than, I want to say, Koreans or Chinese or Japanese. And it could be because there are more of them, and they are definitely more empathetic to Black issues, and they don't have a preconceived idea of what folks are before they get here. They tend to just look around and see what's going on, and they assimilate very well. And I've always applauded them for their attitudes, and that's all I had to say about that.
Okay, Douglas, thanks so much for the call. We appreciate that. May, you want to respond to that?
Well, I'm not sure if I can on a personal level, since I'm not Filipina, and I really can't. But I would love to actually comment on the earlier call, and sure. I think I raised this earlier about the whole perpetual foreigner. You know, this just goes back to education as well. Mm-hmm. Yes, depending on the situation, I have introduced myself as American of Chinese descent, mm-hmm. or I'm ethnically Chinese, and I'm very purposeful about that. I was at an event where we all went around the table to identify ourselves. And it's interesting, we're all mixed. It was predominantly Asian. It was for an Asian American student high school conversation. And I introduced myself as American Chinese descent. Mm-hmm. But when it went to the white person, they just talked about mentioned their name and geographically where they're from and moved on. Everybody else did, the same, whether if they were Asian, they mentioned, their ethnic background. Mm-hmm. Right. And I just, there's a difference between what your nationality is and what your ethnic background is. And these are terms that I think I wish people would better understand. Your nationality is to your country, and your ethnicity is about your DNA, right? And so when I was born and raised in this country, and so I identify as American nationally, but my ethnicity is Chinese. My 23andMe tells me that I am 100% Chinese. But we get stuck on these terms and these labels. And this is why when we get asked, where are you from? I'm like, I'm from New York. Yeah. No, where are you really from? What do you mean? I'm from New York. I know exactly what this person asking. Is trying to get. I know, because it's happened so many times. I know what they're trying to get at. And so I take it as a teaching moment. I go, do you mean what's my ethnic background? And so just, for understanding, please don't ask an Asian person, where are you from?
And I am so glad that you just said that, because I'm going to give each of you, we've got less than 2 minutes left in this show. But I really would like you to say one thing that you would like, particularly the African-American community, to know about your ethnicity, or about, Asians in general, if you want to do that. But be specific. Just one short thing that you would like people to think about. And May, let me start with you, since you already brought that up.
Well, it's not just the African American community. I just say in general, and I go back to what I mentioned earlier. It's let's talk. I think let's have those courageous and bold conversations, transparent conversations. Let's not allow systemic racism and white supremacy to take control. Okay. Let us take control.
All right. That is May Nivar, a fellow with the CEO Action for Racial Equity. Thank you so much for joining us. Ting-Yi, you're next. And you got literally 30 seconds.
Okay. There's an expression sometimes used about Chinese saying ABC, American-born Chinese. I expand that a little bit to be American-born Chinese Dutch because of my ethnicity. And I think it also ties to a speech that Frederick Douglass gave back in 1869 called Our Composite Nation, that really speaks to our diversity. He spoke out very strongly back then about the discrimination that he saw against the Chinese. So I think that's worth mentioning here as well.
Ting-Yi Oei, Education Director for the 1882 Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. And Richard, you get the last 30.
All right. Well, I mean, I think they both just did such a great job. And I would just say, as different as the Asian American experience is and the Black American experience is, and the way that we experience things like discrimination and racism, they're all rooted in the same thing. And we need to show up for each other and understand each other.
Absolutely. That is Richard Luong. He is Director of Institutional Advancement with Rising for Justice. Thank you so much. And thank you, audience, so much for listening today. We hope that today's discussion has given you plenty of food for thought and has created greater cultural understanding for all. Please share this show with a friend. Go to anotherviewradio.org and download the podcast. And if you're curious about the relationship between the Black community and another race or culture, drop us a line at contact@anotherviewradio.org. Who knows, your idea may become a future show. Next week on Another View, transforming community conversation into live theater. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer, and Dr. Barry Graham answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Hey, guess what? There's a new variant of coronavirus. It's called Omicron. Best protection? Get vaccinated. Do it for yourself. Do it for your loved ones. And we'll see you again next Thursday at noon for Another View.
Support comes from Thomas Nelson Community College, now becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College, the first choice to start a career. Gain skills in fields like cybersecurity and education. More at tncc.edu.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.